No Cap Fund presents The Representation Station. All right, we're live again. It's The Representation Station. I'm your host, Jeff Mayhew, and I am here with the crew. And we have a very special guest back on the show. Mr. Brad Smith is on the show today. But first, before we get to him, let's go around the horn and introduce ourselves. Roger, why don't you lead us off tonight?
Hello, I'm Roger from the great state of North Carolina. CPA, married forever, 2 adult children. Happy with everything about my life except the quality of governance under which I live.
All right, Walter.
Hey everyone, I'm Walter Clapp, based out of Laramie, Wyoming. I'm originally from Texas, and I'm a lawyer. I also hold a couple patents related to cybersecurity. I'm equally dissatisfied with the state of representation, specifically in our U.S. House of Representatives. That's what brings us together. It's the common thread, if you will, that brings us here at the Representation Station. And I draw on my knowledge as a lawyer representing clients in what representation means, what it should be. And I look forward to exploring that with you. And you can learn more at our website, which I will show right here, y435.org.
And as I mentioned, I'm your host, Jeff Mayhew. I am a father of 5. And I just kind of started reading history. I kept on reading book after book after book. And this one word kept on coming up over and over and over again. And that word is representation. That's what has led me here to be with you guys tonight. And without further ado, our guest back on the show for the second time is Brad Smith. Brad is a father, law professor, and a lover of liberty and dogs. He is a former FEC commissioner and chairman and founder of the Institute for Free Speech. Brad, thank you so much for coming back on the show today.
Thanks, Jeff. Pleasure to be here. And for those who don't know, the FEC is the Federal Election Commission.
Yes, the Federal Election Commission, which we're going to get into today. I'm very excited to have you back. We had so many questions and we spent so much time talking about gerrymandering last time. We wanted to get some more of your expertise about representation in a way. So first, our first question tonight, and I'm going to start with you, Brad, is why is the First Amendment so important and how does it relate to representation?
Okay. Well, the First Amendment is incredibly important because, I mean, it's almost a necessity to have a functioning democracy. Democracy is based on the idea that instead of using force to resolve our disputes, we're going to use politics. And ultimately, by the way, people sometimes hate this, but compromise. That's what politics is, figuring out the best ways to try to accommodate as many interests as possible. And you can't do that if you can't speak freely about government, if you can't criticize the government that's in power, if you can't talk about preferred solutions. To the founders, this was incredibly important. And I would note it goes hand in hand with another part of the First Amendment. Last time on, we talked a bit about Elbridge Gerry, one of my favorite founding fathers, and Elbridge Gerry, in addition to having gerrymandering named after him, is largely responsible for the First Amendment, including the right to assemble. Because what Gerry understood was that if you just could speak, that was great. But in those days, in the late 17th or 18th century, people were not generally, newspapers took a long time to reach. There's no TV, no internet. People needed to assemble and hear that speaker, and that had to be an important part of the First Amendment too. So it's a right both to speak as individuals, but it's also a right for us to hear as individuals, to hear ideas and hear what others want to say. I just don't know that you can have representative democracy really without at least some protection for free speech. Many countries that are clearly functioning democracies do not have as broad protection for free speech as we do here in the States. I think it's an advantage that we have that broader protection for speech, but you have to have at least a significant room of latitude for people to talk about issues and campaigns and politics and public affairs and whatever else they want to talk about.
Yeah, and this is particularly relevant at this time because, just last week we had, I think, both the left and the right kind of like, I don't know, almost dismissing the First Amendment, between, criticisms about Charlie Kirk's assassination, people being attacked for that. The whole Jimmy Kimmel thing, supposedly, I have, the FCC, sent an email or a message about, him being on the air that was somewhat threatening. And I think you're right. I think, it's important for representation. I think, historically, I think the biggest threat or biggest strike against the First Amendment was the gag rule back in the antebellum period. Because what it did, they were tired of the petitions for slavery, and then it literally silenced, any representative in the House trying to, or in Congress trying to talk about this specific issue. So I'll kick it over to Walter real quick. And, why is the First Amendment so important to you? And obviously, I know you're going to bring it back to representation.
Yeah, I'll just echo what George Washington thought, which is that, the First Amendment, specifically the right to free speech, really exists, I think, as Mr. Smith has stated, in service of a constitutional republic. A functioning democracy requires the First Amendment. And so really the idea is we need to speak freely so that we can source better quality representatives, right? If you can't debate freely, the merits or the demerits of particular representatives or ideas, you wind up getting whatever they want and not what the people want. And so it is of paramount importance, I believe, to have the First Amendment. But we have to recognize that the First Amendment was really supposed to be second, right? The first proposed amendment was to give us this foundational right of representation. And then what became the First Amendment, this right to free speech, would have helped bolster that right to representation. As we know, we didn't get that fundamental right to representation. And so the First Amendment in some ways is limited because the purpose for which it served or was meant to serve has been capped. 1929, obviously, the House passed the quote-unquote Permanent Apportionment Act. There's nothing permanent about it except for your unwillingness to get off the couch and do something about it. And when we do restore this fundamental right to representation, suddenly then the First Amendment, our right to speak freely, becomes all the more important, because then we've got a real shot at ensuring a better form of representation is flourishing throughout the nation. And so here I'll just give a quick plug for my working definition of representation, which is two-way education. It's as simple as that. Education requires action, but education in part happens when we have a freedom to speak. Right? We need that freedom to speak in order to educate our representatives and for our representatives then to educate us back.
So I'll kind of connect that back to what Brad was saying. He hit on Elbridge Gerry and the right to assemble. And I think that's very important because you can be one individual speaking, right? But like you are speaking into a void. Your voice is very tiny. And I think that this ability to assemble, is somehow connected to being able to grow the house, right? Because you need to be able to have somebody to speak for you. Like you said, it's a two-way educational. They listen to you, they inform you. And when you have problems, your representative is supposed to be able to, speak on your behalf. But I'll kick it over to Roger. Why is the First Amendment so important?
Well, First Amendment's first and foremost about free speech, and free speech is necessary when you have the rule of law, right? The rule of law only exists in our minds as a concept. We have discussed it, right? Rule of force, you can feel that out in the wild. Somebody forces you to do what they want you to do. But rule of law just exists because we talk about the concept, we create the concept, we keep it in our minds. We have to be able to keep that discussion going about the efficacy and the cost effectiveness of the laws that govern us. If we want to maintain rule of law in a robust way, we have to have free speech. We have to have the ability to communicate freely with the lawmakers about what's working and what isn't.
Brad, I'm going to kick it back to you. What do you have to say about our little panel discussion here, and kind of tying this into representation and how important it is to speak. And then also, if I don't know if you want to touch on, the news cycle at all, and the different lawmakers kind of maybe not embracing free speech as much as I think that some Americans would like them to. I understand ugly speech is ugly speech, but yeah, it's protected too.
Well, there's a couple things here. I think, by the way, that what the three of you have all said pretty much covers the connection with representation. But to address the second part then of that question, there's a few things that people need to remember. So first of all, the First Amendment applies against the government of the United States, right? It doesn't apply against private individuals. So you don't have to let people say whatever they want when they're on your property, when they're in your business. You can fire people if you don't like their speech and so on. There's nothing, not a problem there. Now there is a problem. Government cannot do indirectly what it's not allowed to do directly. So the government can't threaten a private actor and say, for example, you fire this person or we will take some government action against you. And then when the employer fires the offending speaker, the government says, well, we didn't violate the First Amendment. The employer fired him, right? You can't do that. Um, at the same time, the Supreme Court has, very unwisely in my view, in a case decided just a little over a year ago called Murphy v. Missouri, made it very hard to bring that kind of claim. In order to bring a claim alleging that the government has pressured some private actor to violate your First Amendment rights, you have to show that the government specifically threatened them with action and that they acted specifically on the basis of those threats. So, general government threats to sort of do this or else, something bad will happen. Bad's going to happen? Just trust us, something bad's going to happen. That sort of thing. The Supreme Court seems to say is not enough to get you into court. And I think that's a very bad ruling because it gives a lot of leeway for the government to make sort of general threats. And that's what people are complaining about in the last week or so. Brendan Carr, the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, who has been a stalwart for free speech for decades, said that if Jimmy Kimmel wasn't taken care of, I don't know if he specifically said he had to be terminated, but he said you have to do something about Jimmy Kimmel. We could do this the easy way or the hard way, but these stations have licenses. This isn't in the public interest. What he said is both objectively false and subjectively, to I think most people, really nasty and mean. Um, you know, I think that's the kind of thing government shouldn't be able to do. But under this decision in Murphy, it's probably would be very tough for Kimmel to win a lawsuit there. And, I think that a lot of people on the left who are very upset about the threats made at Kimmel have to be willing to disavow the Murphy decision. If they're not going to disavow Murphy, people on the right who, are familiar with the law in this area are not going to say, okay, fine, Kimmel gets his job back or can sue the government, but Murphy hangs out there as a bar to anybody else in the future suing the government, so that when AOC or someone is the president and tries to enact a censorship regime, the left's all going to say, well, he doesn't pass the Murphy test. Either Murphy applies everywhere or it doesn't apply at all. And unfortunately, right now, I think the answer is it applies everywhere, and it's very, very tough to bring a case alleging this kind of indirect government coercion. So that's a real problem that we have going on. If I can just say, a couple more words about it, it strikes me that one of our big problems in recent years, I would say two problems. One is there's an idea people have, they want to say that, well, you have free speech, but speech has consequences. Okay. How would you like this for a rule? First Amendment applies to the government. The government can't censor your speech. But if you go ahead and publish this podcast or publish a blog or comments on the web or whatever, and the government doesn't like it, then they can throw you in jail. You got to speak. We're just saying you got to have consequences for it, right? Nobody thinks that's a good idea. Nobody thinks that's consistent with the First Amendment. And we need to think that way in our private lives a bit too. Obviously, there are some times when speech gets so beyond the pale that it's appropriate to take action to fire an employee or something like that. But most of the time, we should, recognize that people have a lot of diverse opinions. We shouldn't engage generally in campaigns to find, obscure people who posted stupid things on the internet and try to get them fired from their job. It's sort of a perspective. And people say, well, why should I have to work with a fascist, or why should I have to have a fascist in my restaurant or something? Okay, great. True. You don't want Nazis in your restaurant. Great, get rid of them. Even if they're not doing anything Nazi-like, they're just sitting there in clothes eating, But at the same time, we have to get the perspective and realize that Mitch McConnell is not a Nazi, right? Lawrence Summers, the former Treasury Secretary, is not a Nazi. 75 million people who voted for Donald Trump are not Nazis, right? We need to get some perspective here. And I think when we have that kind of perspective and that kind of general private tolerance for free speech and disagreement, we have what I call the spirit of the First Amendment, which ultimately supports that direct and specific ban on government attempting to censor its citizens. And again, all of this, including speech in the private arena, is vital to representative government.
Yeah, I think
And I'll just note, I think the term of art of the Murphy v. Missouri decision is it's jawboning. So when the government does kind of covertly what it can't do overtly, it's called jawboning. And the other note I'll make is that it appears that Disney is bringing back Kimmel despite the threats made by Carr. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. But I would agree with Mr. Smith that we do all need to be on the same page. I think left and right. I think just like we can be on the same page about representation, we should be able to be on the same page about the First Amendment. These are kind of the bedrocks of our society. So sorry to step on you, Jeff. Go ahead.
no, that's fine. That was great. Yeah, I mean, I think to your point, I'm an employer, right? And I have employees, and if my employees are saying or doing something, and I have the right to have rules over my domain, right? The thing that I've built, and I think that's an important distinction to make. I think to the point you made, I see both the left and the right, and I see this in local politicians, which I think is almost scary, where they're finding people that have that maybe volunteer for campaigns for, the opposing party. They're finding their social media pages, things that they don't agree with. They're posting them on their social media platforms, amplifying their voice and saying, this is wrong. Their employer should fire them. And it's kind of like the idea of using the market to attack the government. And I don't think it's the intent, right? I think that, again, free speech is free speech. You don't agree with it, that's fine, but we don't need to be trying to get everybody fired. We're just going to create more tension that way. I think the best way is to debate these ideas, bring new ideas to the table as opposed to, creating more division.
Yeah, it's not a healthy trend to be seeking out people and trying to get them fired for their jobs when they didn't do anything in their job that was wrong. Now, I would say, though, that with something like Jimmy Kimmel, it's a much tougher question, right? Jimmy Kimmel's job is to build an audience, and not just for his own show, but for the network generally, for other shows, make people feel good and warm about it. And the comments he made were both factually wrong and frankly kind of nasty and mean spirited, and coming at a time when there was a lot of heightened tension and a lot of people who might feel for years, we're tired of all these evening talk shows that are just blasting conservatives all the time. But now at this point in time, given the assassination of Charlie Kirk, some of these people are just going to say, that's enough, I've had it, I'm not going to listen to this stuff anymore. And one thing we should note is that when what triggered ABC, at least temporarily lifting the program, was that many of the affiliates said, we're just not going to carry it anymore. And most of these affiliates, Sinclair Broadcasting and Nexstar, both have very conservative political leadership. They're known for that. And it's possible that their leaders just said, yeah, we just don't think we need to carry this anymore. Kimmel's ratings have been dropping for many, many years. So, I don't think we should be, this is the other thing about this idea of cancel culture. We should realize that each case is sort of different. And that is, again, another reason why I think, we're best off to all have a spirit of good faith, of tolerance, of recognizing mistakes, but let the people closest to it decide. The people at the station have a better idea whether carrying Kimmel is going to cost them or not. Some people goes out and tries to fire somebody at the Office Depot because he went make signs for the Charlie Kirk Memorial or something like that. To me, I'd say, look, that's for the employer to handle. The employer, I hope, would talk to the person, but he should consider the age of the person. Is he experienced? Should he know better? Is he new? Is he generally a problem? Is he generally a great employee who just had a lapse of judgment? And again, in that kind of spirit of tolerance and openness, that spirit of the First Amendment, I think everybody needs to just take a deep breath and lighten up a little bit and recognize that it's good that we hear these views and we have to be able to talk. As Charlie Kirk himself used to say, when people stop talking, bad things start happening, whether it's a marriage or politics or whatever. And that's so true.
Yeah, big time. Um, okay, so let's switch gears just a little bit here. Still First Amendment topic. Um, but I think one of the big hot topics in politics is always about the money in politics, and many people blame the Supreme Court ruling Citizens United. So I was hoping if you could you give us a, I don't know, a basic explanation of what Citizens United is for our audience so they can understand? Because I don't know if a lot of people, I think a lot of people get the gist of Citizens United, but maybe they don't understand it fully. And when I got into this, I was very against Citizens United. I thought it should be repealed. The more I've studied, the more I realized that I don't really know if that's possible. So just curious your take on that as well.
Yeah. So Citizens United is a widely misunderstood case, and we need to lay some groundwork first. So some people say, well, Citizens United held that corporations are people. It did not hold that. In fact, that is not a controversial position in the law. Corporations aren't people, obviously, but they are associations of people, groups of people. People form corporations in order to accomplish their objectives. So if you want to go down and protest in front of City Hall, you can do that. And if I want to go protest in front of City Hall, I can do that. And if the two of us want to do it, we can both do it. And we can do it together. And if a whole bunch of people start joining us and we start raising money to print banners and to bring, to travel about to other capitals or whatever it is we want to do, to produce podcasts, that sort of thing, we may adopt the corporate form to achieve what we want to achieve. And that's fine. We don't lose our individual rights just because we've adopted that corporate form. And this is not a new idea. This was the idea of corporate personhood goes back into the early 19th century as a matter of constitutional law. At the absolute latest, this was settled by 1819 in a case called Dartmouth College v. Woodward. But really, the roots go back further into the common law and the very dawn of corporate life. Okay. So the question is not, are corporations people? The question is, are there reasons why we should limit spending by this type of association of people in politics? One more thing on the corporations of people. I want to know, nobody argued that. It wasn't argued by the dissenters. It wasn't argued by the majority. It wasn't argued in the briefs. That was not what the case was about. So anybody thinks Citizens United is about corporations are people, you just got to go back and you got to start over and realize again, the question is not whether corporations are people. The question is whether there are elements about a corporation that should allow us to censor the speech of that corporation. Now, the case says merely that a corporation can spend money from its own resources, from its general treasury, to promote the candidates of its choice, to support or oppose those candidates. Okay. Prior to this, recognize that you could not, in a corporate setting, spend a dime to support a candidate for office, not a penny. If a corporate executive took a stamp out of his desk drawer and put it on a letter he was saying to a friend saying, hey, I think Mitt Romney's a great guy. Why don't you send him some money? That was a violation of the law. You couldn't ask your secretary to, just drop a letter in the post box. I mean, nothing, zero was the cap. Okay. Now let's think about that. Is that really a good idea? I mean, corporations, they employ lots of people. They're a major part of our economy. They have millions and millions of shareholders. They're heavily regulated. They have much to say and much to contribute to our political life. And I think that was the general ruling of the Supreme Court in Citizens United, was to say you can't ban them simply because they're corporations. And to give you a feel for what the case was actually about, Citizens United was a group, and some people, older listeners, will remember a filmmaker named Michael Moore. And in 2004, he produced a movie called Fahrenheit 9/11. It was a very anti-George Bush movie. In fact, Moore specifically said part of his goal was to make sure that it helped to defeat George Bush in his reelection bid for the presidency. So Citizens United, which is a conservative group, tried to make up their own documentary. It was not nearly as good, not as slickly produced, but it was a documentary about John Kerry, the opposition. And the FEC, I was on the FEC at the time, said, "Nope, you can't do that. We think that's a violation of the Federal Election Campaign Act." So they didn't do it. We said, basically, you're not really a filmmaker, you're political agitators. So Citizens United made a whole bunch of movies over the next few years. They became movie producers. And in 2008, they produced a movie. It was called Hillary, the movie, because everybody knew Hillary Clinton would be the Democratic candidate for president in 2008. And they wanted it to be absolutely clear that this was about a candidate for office. And they came and they said, we're going to show this movie. And the FEC has told us we're not film producers. And they challenged that in court. Now, think about that. Can the First Amendment really mean that you can ban a documentary movie about a major presidential candidate in an election year for no reason other than the fact that at some point in its production or distribution, it was financed by a corporation, in this case, a nonprofit corporation, right? And by the way, that would be like every other movie you have ever seen in your life on a streaming service or cable or broadcast or in a theater. Okay. Can that really be the First Amendment, that you can ban just because it was produced by a corporation? No other reason. If Exxon Mobil were a partnership, it'd be fine. They could do the movie. But because they're a corporation, can't do the movie. Right? They just have to organize differently. I think that cannot be right as a matter of First Amendment law. And I think the real radical part of Citizens United was the dissenters, four justices who said, yeah, sure, you can ban a movie just because it's made by a corporation. You could have banned Michael Moore's movie. We didn't, but you could have banned Michael Moore's movie, Fahrenheit 9/11. You could ban any documentary movie about a candidate. So that's what Citizens United is really about. I think the respectable position criticizing Citizens United is to say that there should still be caps on corporate spending, that there are elements to corporate power in the corporate form that justify those caps for a well-functioning democracy. I disagree with those arguments. I think those arguments are incorrect. But that's in my mind, the sort of respectable, legitimate argument against Citizens United. The idea that you can ban somebody just because they're a corporation is silly. Now, the other thing that's worth noting is that Citizens United did not allow unlimited spending in elections. That goes back to a case called Buckley v. Vallejo from 1976, which held that you can't limit people's spending in an election. And so whatever the First Amendment is about, it's about saying you can't tell somebody you've spoken too much, or this person needs to speak more, or whatever. That the First Amendment is about keeping government out of making those decisions. But Citizens United did have sort of an attitudinal shift. That is, before Citizens United, a guy like Elon Musk still could have gone out and spent $220 million. He could, he could do that if he wanted to. People tended not to do that. Okay. But after Citizens United, it became a more common thing to do. I think it made a lot of people go, oh, I didn't even realize we actually can do that. It's not against the law. And in another case that came right after it, called SpeechNow.org versus the FEC, made possible the formation of super PACs, which made it much easier for someone like Elon Musk to spend that kind of money. So that's what the case is about. And I think the argument against it has to be that there's something about a corporation that means we should limit their speech in a way that we don't limit the speech of other people and entities. That's long enough, so I'm going to pause there.
No,
Yeah.
that's great. That's great. I'm gonna get to Roger here next, but I think it goes to my next question is like, again, I don't necessarily know if it's repealable. You can't, overturn Citizens United. Like you said, it's about free speech. But to your argument is a lot of people feel really frustrated by the system, the amount of money that floods in specifically from the super PACs, and I think ultimately whatever happens with campaign finance, it's got to come from Congress. It's got to be legislation, writing basic rules. But I'll kick it to Roger now. Roger, what's your take on Citizens United as somebody who's not a lawyer, who watches TV and watches this mess that we're in? Like, what's your opinion about it?
My opinion about it is that we as a society spend way, way, way too much of our available scarce resources on politics. And it only got worse with Citizens United. The totals, the dollar values just keep going larger and larger and larger. I'm against Citizens United. I get everything Brad said, and I cannot disagree with him, but I still don't like it. I guess what it boils down to for me is, if we're gonna allow corporations which have vastly larger stores of wealth to spend, if we're going to allow them to have unlimited power to spread any message they want, including lies, including misinformation, we need to have equally powerful and sweeping laws that can be used to hold them to account for such behavior. And I don't believe we have these other set of laws, strong and sweeping enough to hold corporations to account if they go rogue.
Mm. Walter, I'm gonna let you go next. Well, you're last,
Yeah.
so you just
And
deal with it.
well, I appreciate Brad's explanation, and Brad is Mr. Smith for the listeners there. Brad Smith is who we're talking to. I want to push him. I want to push you, Brad, on. Do you see any potential distinction in the case law between a publicly traded corporation versus a privately held corporation? And similarly, between a wholly domestic corporation and a multinational corporation who, derives, say over 20% of its revenues from overseas?
Sure. So, by the way, the kind of distinctions you just made, again, takes us to the debate that I think we ought to be having. I remember shortly after the decision was decided, I did a program on Pacifica Radio, which is a nonprofit incorporated radio chain, very left wing, and the person, I made the point. I said, look, we're on a corporate radio station. Can the government censor this program just because you're a corporation? And the hostess said, she said, well, I think there's a big difference between, Pacifica Radio and ExxonMobil. And I said, yes, exactly. That's it. The fact that they're both corporations should not be the defining characteristic. It's
Right.
not what's really the relevant point. So you've raised a couple other distinctions. Now, before I get to those, I want to say a couple things in response to Roger's comments, because I think Roger really represents how most people instinctively feel. And I totally get that. And I totally get why it's bothersome to folks. First, I would point out, though, we spend in a 2-year election cycle about $15 billion on politics, right? Procter and Gamble alone spends more than that advertising, right? So, and that's one company. So what we spend on politics is really very, very little. Remember, the federal budget's a couple $1 trillion now, and we're spending 15 billion on politics, for how we're gonna divvy it up, how urge people to spend it. So it's really not a lot of money being spent in any kind of raw sense like that. Now, then the question I would raise is, well, what does it mean to say a company goes rogue? I mean, if a company spreads falsehoods, well, anybody can spread falsehoods. Individuals can spread falsehoods. I mean, that's a different issue. Again, it's not corporations. It's are people saying things that aren't true, and do we think that can be addressed under the First Amendment? Some people have suggested we rethink some defamation precedents, like New York Times v. Sullivan, and we won't even go into that. There's a lot there, but that would be the thing. It's not a corporate issue. The same notion would apply to labor unions, to partnerships, and to individuals as well. And I think people should hear from corporations. I mean, imagine that you're working out in Iowa, and the local factory wants to run a commercial saying, "Hey, look, our congressman is opposing these tariffs, and we've got to have tariffs, or our company's going to go under." Now, personally, I'm not a big fan of tariffs, but okay, look, we've had tariffs for a long time. That's a respectable political position. Voters should be able to hear that message, and they should hear it from the corporation, not from individuals. I mean, they should hear it from individuals too, but it's important that it come from the corporation saying, this is what we think. You should vote for this guy, because otherwise this factory is going to close down and take 450 jobs directly out of this community, plus however many people rely on it, and so on, and be devastating to this, small city in Iowa or wherever it might be. I think people have a right to hear that kind of information, should hear it. Now, Walter, you raised a couple of good questions. So, what about some of the differences? So, private, public, for example. One thing that we should note is that most corporations are not wealthy. There are only about 2,000 corporations in the country that even operate political action committees, which is all individual money. The vast majority of money spent in U.S. elections, the vast majority of that 15 billion comes from individuals. A corporate PAC is members of the corporation can give money to the PAC, which then handles the administration and spends it and so on. Generally speaking, small corporations are more likely to do political expenditures than large corporations. Why? Because large corporations are spending their money. They got lobbyists. They have tons of lobbyists and they can go directly in. Small corporations can't do that. They don't have lobbyists. The best they have is their trade associations that might be able to spend some money. So if a small corporation and small corporations can't afford to operate PACs, it's very expensive to operate a PAC, and you can't just go and ask anybody to give money to your PAC. You're very limited, and so a lot of small corporations don't even have enough people who are legally allowed to give to the PAC to make PAC spending. So I think those corporations need to be able to give and spend directly. There's also some division in the case as to whether Congress should have a different rule or the court should have a different rule for nonprofit organizations, such as Citizens United, that people voluntarily give money to specifically to engage in politics, as opposed to Ford Motor Company or Microsoft or Apple or whatever that you invest in to make profit. But the court ultimately held that was not a distinction it cared to make. And then you raise, Walter, the question of foreign contributors. And of course, the issue there is, what is a foreign corporation? Under the current law, a corporation, in order to spend in U.S. elections, has to be incorporated in the United States and headquartered in the United States. Furthermore, all decisions have to be made by U.S. citizens. Now, we can all say, well, this is a bunch of malarkey. If you're incorporated, just because you're incorporated in the United States and you're headquartered here, if you're a wholly owned subsidiary of a Chinese company, years ago it was the Japanese we were all frightened about. Now it's the Chinese we're all frightened about. If you're a wholly owned subsidiary of a foreign company, even though the U.S. citizens are making the decision, they know where their bread is buttered. They know who can hire and fire them, and so you're going to have that question as to foreign influence. The price, of course, of trying to do away with that is that you are cutting out major American players. For example, for many years, Verizon, everybody knows of Verizon, right? It was owned by Vodafone, a British telecommunications company. Is it really mean that Verizon therefore should not be able to participate in politics to the same extent as its other U.S. rivals who may be seeking favors from the government or that sort of thing? Verizon employs like 30,000 people in the United States. They're headquartered in New Jersey. So it's a complex issue again, and I think that it's really not worth the cost of trying to ban it. Corporations have been sanctioned when foreigners have engaged in directing corporate PAC activities. And the fact is, there's just very, very little direct giving by for-profit corporate companies, let alone by foreign for-profit corporate entities. I mean, we know how much they give because it all has to be disclosed. And so I just think at this point, I understand, and again, I think Roger is much more in tune with the popular vibe than I am, but I think ultimately that vibe comes because people, right? Most people don't have years and years to think about this and study this stuff. That's what I've done. That's what has been my life's work. And money in politics doesn't quite work the way that we intuitively think. And so often your views change and you begin to realize corporations aren't spending a lot of money. Foreign corporations aren't spending a lot of money. If you can't spend money, who benefits? The press benefits. Nobody seems to want to regulate the press, although most of the press is incorporated. The New York Times is incorporated. Nobody says, well, the New York Times shouldn't be able to spend money just because they're incorporated. Got to have the free press. But why the New York Times? What makes them special as opposed to like you three guys or me, or some little business I'm associated with? Why shouldn't we be able to promote our views? And what makes us think that the press is not going rogue or spreading disinformation? I mean, the press has been inaccurate a few times in recent years. So I think it becomes a very complex issue. And unfortunately, my message is kind of pessimistic, which is to say democracy's messy. It never works like that homeroom election that you had in 10th grade. It's going to have, unfair. People are going to be different in their abilities to influence politics, have different levels of influence. There are going to be openings for corruption. We have to try to police corruption, and we have to, as voters, pay attention and try to vote against people who we don't think are properly representing the district. But it's not going to be perfect. It's just going to be better than
Ye
the alternatives.
yeah, so I'm gonna get to the corruption part in the next question, but I wanted to go back. Roger, did you wanna respond at all to what Brad had there? What do you think?
No, no, I get it. I understand what he said. I don't necessarily disagree with the Citizens United decision, but I still don't like it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It does not make me happy. I do not think it. I can't even put into words why I don't like it. I just
Jeff,
don't like it, and part of it has to do with the imbalance of power that
yeah.
I and many citizens perceive. There's this money bags over here that can spend years and years crushing the little guy in court, and I've seen it happen personally. A person I worked for about 6 weeks before I determined he was a crook, and I got out of there quick because I was advised, don't cross him. He will spend everything he has to burn you, and he has a lot. So,
But burning you and suing you in court again is just a different level thing. Ultimately, the money that's spent on politics is spent to try to convince you to vote one way or another, and you still have your agency there when it comes down.
oh, well, yeah, okay. Yes, we still have agency, and we can still vote. And does that vote translate? That's another discussion for another show.
So,
Well,
uh,
that's
so
what it's all about.
well, I want to drill in on one thing that I mentioned, sort of in this distinction between publicly traded versus private corporations. You mentioned the sort of like the common law doctrine that at the end of the day, corporations are treated as, conglomerations of people, which they are. But I think there's this sense today that publicly traded corporations are not really that anymore, right? That, okay, yes, Hobby Lobby is one thing, Koch brothers or Koch Industries, that's one thing. But then you talk about like an Apple or a Google, and they're just in it for like total domination, right? Like they're just, and there is case law that says a publicly traded corporation can basically consider nothing other than, the almighty dollar and its profit objective. And that, to me, right, there's this inherent tension with large publicly traded corporations that are often multinational, that they're not really after truth seeking, right? There is something compelling them to lie for the dollar, and I think that maybe gets at some of the uncomfortableness that people feel around Citizens United. They don't know why exactly. I think it's somewhere there, right? That these publicly traded companies that are beholden to, BlackRock and Vanguard, really, like the pension companies that ultimately hold the shares.
Private equity.
It's like 4 or 5 layers of humans behind, the decision maker. And I'm kind of speaking to what Roger's saying. I'm trying to channel some of my legal knowledge into his frustrations. And so I realize that there's a lot of precedent here, but do you think that there is a argument under the history of corporations, where that meets with the First Amendment, to say, we could treat a publicly traded company that ultimately isn't really accountable to a group of identifiable humans differently than a private corporation that is, in some immediate sense, very tied to a group of humans.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think is that private corporations, most small corporations are private corporations, right? And as I said, they're
Yeah,
disadvantaged. They actually benefit from Citizens United probably more than big corporations do. Um,
100%
but
agree.
there are some big private corporations, like you mentioned, Koch Industries, which is a very large
Yeah.
private. So and for most people, the concern has always been size. But I think you're also onto something in saying is that disconnect of layers of management. You feel like they're playing with other people's money, and corporate democracy is a little bit of a sham there, and there's not really a way to hold corporations accountable there. I would only point out again that, corporate speech can be honest or truthful. It can be shaded or not shaded. They're self interested, but most of us are self interested. And I think in the end, you're best off to have a system in which everybody gets to play the game and the government isn't sitting around and trying to decide, who's going to get to, again, speak more and who's going to speak less. Remember, corporations, talk about the big Fortune 500 companies spend about 10 times as much money on lobbying as they do on
Hmm.
campaigns. They much prefer lobbying. And so
Hmm.
are we then going to cut off lobbying too? Are we going to say that people, if you're a shareholder in a corporation and the government says we're going to regulate that corporation, you're just out of luck. Your corporate representatives can't even go to Washington and say this would be a really dumb idea. You shouldn't do this, right? And sometimes they are really dumb ideas. I mean, corporations are self-interested. That doesn't mean they're always wrong, right? Um,
Yeah.
so you have that issue there. And then I note as well that, she point out, yes, they have a duty to pursue profit, but do remember that's been very broadly defined under what's called the business judgment rule, that it's up to the corporate board to
Hmm.
decide what produces long-term profit. And corporations spend about 10 times as much money on sort of uh, public charities as they spend on lobbying. So about 100 times as much as they spend on all direct political campaign activity. And this is, funding symphonies and sports arenas and sponsoring, little leagues, kids teams and things like that. So again, it starts to paint a much more complex picture. And I think to go much further, we're going to have to take up the rest of this podcast and several others. But again,
Okay.
I don't think that Roger is foolish or ignorant or stupid or anything. I think he channels how most people instinctively feel, and I think these concerns are real. I would just say that for me, I've never been convinced that when we really get down to it and talk about what are we going to do about it and how would we do it, that you end up with an improvement. I think that First Amendment doctrine that just everybody gets to play the game to their heart's content is the best way to go.
So maybe we need to change the game, and I think that will take us, Jeff, to the next thought.
Yeah, so I'm gonna so my next question on my list I'm gonna come back to because you kind of you touched exactly what I wanted to go next, which is all right. So let's change the game. A lot of problems with campaign finance, a lot of money being spent in presidential races and congressional races. Is uncapping and expanding the House of Representatives a better path for tackling campaign finance? The way I look at it, it's a supply and demand, right? There is only a limited supply of congressional representatives, which means the cost for the campaigns goes up. If you want to lower the cost for the campaigns, you have to increase the supply. You want to lower the amount of money being spent to each individual person running for office, increase the supply. Do you think that's a better path? And if so, why?
Yeah, this is something until you asked the question, I haven't really given much thought to, but I have two kind of instinctive reactions. One is, with more House seats, you're probably going to see an increase in overall political spending. It's going to still be a lot of money spent. In some districts, it may not change the amount much at all. If you're in a district in Manhattan, in New York, the fact that your district is smaller isn't going to change anything. You still got to hit all the same TV stations, all the same kind of billboards around town, all that kind of stuff still has to be done. The effect on your campaign would be very negligible. You might do a bit less door knocking, but most of the stuff's going to be the same. On the other hand, in some states where in areas where you have bigger geographic districts that cover more geographic area, a seat might be no longer have to address two media markets and only have to advertise in one media market. Travel might actually become significantly less for some of these sprawling districts in rural areas. And those kinds of things would probably lower the cost of campaigning for an individual seat. And that might have some benefits to the extent we're concerned about the amount of time that candidates have to spend raising money, concern we didn't really address before, and to the extent we're concerned just about the amounts spent in any given race. So you might end up with more total spending, but less spending on the average race, and that might be something that I think most people would find congenial for sort of the reasons that Roger and Walter have set out.
Roger, what do you think about that? What do you think about if we channel our energy, which we kind of already are, in uncapping the
Hmm.
House? Do you think that's going to help the campaign finance? Would that like I mean, it's not going to make it better all the way. Again, to your point, if you uncap the House, you're going to have a better chance of actually maybe writing some campaign finance law that you agree with. But do you think that's the best path then, as opposed to attacking Citizens United?
Yes, I absolutely think that it's a better path than trying to get Citizens United overturned. I believe that could happen at some point in the future, but it would be a tough slog, even tougher, much tougher than uncapping the House. And in response to this question, I fall back on a generalization, a position that I firmly believe, and that's any particular reform that you can think of relating to the federal government specifically, but other government too. Any reform you're interested in, your chances of success improve when we uncap the House, increase the size of the legislature, move the extremists out so serious people can agree on things. So, whatever particular reform, including campaign finance reform, if you want a durable solution, right, you need to expand, to Jeff's word, the supply of people who can are involved in making that decision. More voices involved makes a better product, right? And so that's I fall back on that. Any reform you can mention, including campaign finance, I believe will have a better solution from having more representatives than not.
Walter, your take?
Yeah, I mean, I think if, as Brad said, the objective is ultimately compromise, that, as Roger just said, we're more likely to find compromise when you have more reasonable heads prevailing in a larger house. I do ultimately think this question about, what sort of impact on the money question does uncapping have depends on the number, right? So if you have an uncap from 435 to 635, the impact is going to be minimal. On the other hand, if you have an uncap that aligns with the First Amendment or the first proposed amendment, as currently written and sitting in the ether, and you have 7,000 representatives, right? Then the media markets change considerably. The amount changes more drastically, and frankly, the money is probably going to matter less than how many doors get knocked on. As we've said here, we don't take a position on what sort of uncap is best, because ultimately, even a small uncap is going to introduce an event horizon past which we don't know exactly what's going to happen. There are going to be some reforms. There's going to be enough new blood that some reasonably compromised but intelligent legislation will be passed that could address some of these really difficult questions. And my takeaway from this so far really is like, man, each of these questions, you're like, oh, this is such a simple question. It's like, no, like you could spend 10 years studying just this question and still have reasonable disagreements, right? And that is what I think is so important, and the reason we need a legislature that is actually looking at seriously these complicated questions, because they're difficult problems that need compromise. And if we don't get that, what you have is an executive, legislating by executive fiat. And I think we can all agree that that is bad for us internally, and it's also bad for our foreign partners who are relying on us to be somewhat stable and not bipolar, as frankly, America has been over the last decade, if not longer. So that would
Yeah.
be my take.
So, Brad, I'm going to come back to you here, and I'm going to ask the last question. I'm just going to leave this one just for Brad because he's kind of the expert in this, and hopefully he gives us some good insight on this. Is what's the most common way politicians circumvent campaign finance law?
Uh, well, that's a little bit of a loaded question, right? If they're obeying the law, they're not circumventing it. Okay. If they're not obeying the law, then they're violating it. So I don't know. What I would say is this: think about a lot of regulation. For example, regulating pollutants. You'll find a lot of people in manufacturing think the environmental regulations are too strict. They don't think they're realistic. They don't think ultimately they're good for the United States. And that view is probably shaped by the fact that they're particularly bad for those manufacturers themselves. But even with those views, they don't usually say pollution's a good thing. We ought to pollute more. Let's go out and pollute, right? They recognize that it's bad and they wish they could get rid of it. They just think that there's costs and benefits, and they draw the line differently than the people who passed the laws did. Now compare that to political regulation, campaign finance regulation. We tell people all the time, you need to get engaged. You need to, give people encourage voter turnout, get people to turn out. You need to spend money to educate voters and so on. And then all of a sudden we turn around and say, oh, but wait a minute. We're spending too much money on politics. This is bad. You've been bad people for doing that. And I think that's a problem that's always going to be an issue here. Most people would like to pollute less if they can figure out a cost effective way to do it. Most restaurants would like to take more precautions against salmonella or other, food poisonings in a cost-effective manner. That's what they want to do. But politics, we kind of, they recognize those side effects are bad. But in politics, we keep saying this stuff is good, and then we still try to limit it. And what that means is that anytime you limit some form of political speech, people will find other ways to get involved in the system. And those other ways won't necessarily be fair and equal either, nor will they be something in which everybody has, equal influence, nor will they be something in which there's no way of being sort of corrupt but while staying within vaguely legal channels. So I think that's one of the problems you have to understand here. If for example, back in 2002, Congress trying to reduce the cost of campaigning tried to ban ads. This was before Citizens United. So corporations were not just were not allowed to spend money in campaigns, but corporations could spend money to talk about issues and candidates and say, we think you should call your congressman and tell him to vote for this issue, which would be really important to our company, right? They could do that. Okay. So Congress said, okay, if it's within 60 days of an election, they can't even spend corporate money to do that. So then what happened? The corporations ran those same ads 90 days before the election or 120 days before the election. There's always some way that the ripple will keep going out. And the further you try to ban it, people will just keep moving out, sometimes in ways that are more distorting and more costly. So I think we have to be careful about trying to get rid of all circumvention with whatever regulations we have. And again, as I've made clear, I tend to favor pretty close to no regulation of campaign finance, but whatever regulations we might have should be, we should recognize that there's always some people who will violate the law or figure out a clever way around it. No tolerance policies, zero tolerance policies in almost every field we've learned are not really worth the cost. We could stamp out all crime in America if we hired not 50,000 or 100, if we hired 35 million more policemen and put them on the streets, right? We're not going to do that. It's not worth the cost and benefit. We have to be willing to accept some level of, sort of antisocial behavior. So that's not to say we endorse it. It's not to say we don't try to improve it, but we make a mistake if we think that we can just make a perfect world. That's the quest for utopia usually ends up badly.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on Madison number 10 there, with, you can't extinguish, you can try to extinguish, what is the line? Fire, but it's gonna but it's, suck the air out of your breath or something like that, but much more eloquent. And to their point is like ambition counteracts ambition, or as Calhoun put it, power meets power. No matter what rules you create, somebody is going to try to make them work to their advantage. And so, I think to your point is like, okay, well, let's let people decide, be creative, create a level playing field and compete. And I think to what Roger and I think a lot of people, including myself at different points in time, would say is, yeah, but it's not a level playing field. It's regular people can't compete at the same level as other people. But you know, we can get it more into that at another time. I want to shift gears just a little bit here. We've talked a lot about First Amendment. We've talked a lot about campaign finance. We've got, I think, 3 generations on this show right now, and we're looking at I don't know, people aren't really happy with the way things are going. And so my question is, considering that our last 3 presidents have been more Polk, Pierce, and Buchanan than Washington, Lincoln, or Reagan, and our Congress is in a perpetual war for power, do you think the baby boomer and Gen X generation have failed to lead? And do you worry that the failure of their leadership has trickled down to the millennial generation?
Well, I tend not to like that much to talk about politics and generational politics because, for example, late baby boomers and Gen X and early Gen X vote together much more than late baby boomers vote with early baby boomers, or than early Gen X vote with late Gen X. Why? Because the late boomers and the early Gen X had a lot of the same formative experiences that they do remember. They're slightly different ages, but of the great inflation of the 70s, the Reagan campaign, the end of the Cold War, that sort of thing. So talking raw generations is an awfully crude cut. I think though where the failure, if anywhere, has probably been, it has been the failure to of I would say, if we want to say boomers and Gen X have failed to lead, I think what they failed to do is teach small d democratic values to the generations that follow. That ability to tolerate disagreement, to know how to solve problems. There's significant polling showing that millennials and Gen Z are much more likely to think it's okay to shout down speakers on campus, or even to use violent force to stop them from speaking on campus. Things like that, I think, are problematic. And I think the issues here, we get awfully far afield from the main topic of this kind of podcast. I think go to things like the boomers and the early Gen Xers, I think, had a lot more room to play and learn to resolve disputes on their own, whereas later generations had much more regulated childhoods. You play in little league under adult supervision, and you play this under adult supervision, and then you get driven here under adult supervision. And I think there's been a loss in some ways of the ability to people to resolve disputes on their own in a way that ultimately is better than getting in a fist fight. But it's a complicated issue, so I'm probably already too deep into it, and I'm not going to go any further.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think a lot of it has to do with like how people are raised and their ability to learn from their mistakes at a young age. Because when you're younger, and some of those mistakes aren't as I don't know, they don't hold as much weight. They're more fixable when you're smaller and younger than they are when you're an adult. If you get in a fight with your friend down the street and you have a disagreement, it's, and you're 7 years old, it's not the end of the world. You'll eventually make up over the next few years. But if you are having that same type of fight when you're 23 at your first job, then you have consequences. You're probably going to get fired, right? And now you're struggling and maybe you've got other issues. But I digress. I'll move to Walter here. Walter, what's your opinion? As far as generational leadership, and I think Brad hit on another point there is teaching the leadership skills to the next generation might be the thing that is most important here. What do you think?
Yeah, the Fourth Turning, Strauss and Howe's book, talks about generational change, and they did a fairly decent job, I think, of predicting the crisis that we're in now. So I'm not going to dismiss it entirely, but I'll agree that the lines that are drawn are arbitrary. And so, talking about late versus early Gen X, or millennials and boomers, it is kind of it's more complicated, right? Everything that we've been talking about today, to me, is just like, okay, it's just more complicated than it seems on the surface. And I think there is, for me, it's actually it's poor leadership from our corporations, actually, and kind of bringing this back. I do, in talking to people, find there's a continuity in the sense that, man, customer service has gotten worse, right? And that's in the House of Representatives, but that's also like when I have a problem with Spectrum, it's like you can't talk to a human, right? There is this sense of feeling powerless and voiceless. And I'm not saying I know what the solution is, but on the corporate side, but it does seem to me that if people continue to feel powerless in all these different domains, both public and private, they end up turning to violence, right? Because they don't feel like they can talk and resolve their grievances. And so I do think it's important for corporations, frankly, to just probably do a better job. That probably is the solution, right? They have the resources to just invest in customer service and responding to problems and grievances, and not just turning it off to lawyers to shaft the folks. And obviously, uncapping the house, I think, ultimately is the way that we create a real sense of voice, and education, between the generations. Um, an 18-year-old should be able to call up their congressman's office and learn about Citizens United, right? They shouldn't have to rely on Google or AI to discern all of the intricate details that Brad's gone through here. That should be something that the average congressional office should be able to walk through. The complexity, right? They should be able to walk through the complexity. And so I think, again, all of this is super complicated, and I think the question is, how do you help average Americans, or how do we help average Americans feel like they have a voice in all of this complexity? And I think the answer is, it's our politicians, but it's also our corporate representatives. It's the folks that do have the ability to offer better customer service.
Yeah, I love how you're saying that as a lawyer, because a lot non-lawyers feel, maybe like we don't understand what's going on. Things are written a certain way. Personally, anytime somebody threatens a lawsuit against you and you're a small business, like it's kind of you just kind of feel out of your depth immediately. You know it's going to cost you a lot of money. You maybe don't feel capable of handling it yourself, and it's just a big headache. And I think we've gotten into that, but I you know let me go to Let me go to Roger first, and then I'll chime in it real quick. We got one more question I want to get through, so I want to go ahead and get Roger in here.
Yes, I believe we, and I say that as someone right on that edge between Boom and Gen X, we failed the generation. But um, the reference I was going to bring up, Walter made the reference to The Fourth Turning is Here, that book. But also, not just that one, Machiavelli wrote about this 500 years ago in the Discourses. It's a predictable pattern in a republic, right? At some point, generations progress, and they fail to instill in the young the important lessons, right? Or I should say, what they believe is important changes from generation to generation. There is no steady through line of really critical lessons. The lessons are forgotten, and we have to relearn the lessons all over again, right? The philosopher Santayana said, those who do not remember history are doomed to repeat it. Machiavelli wrote about it. Neil Howe has written about it in the last 2 decades. This is a feature of the human species, right? Once we get past the crisis we're in now, maybe we'll do a better job on the far side of having this through line through the generations of civic education, but I doubt it, because we are humans after all.
Yeah, and touching on the and I use the generations because it's just easy to explain, right? But I mean, Brad makes a good point. Where it's a wide gap. And then looking at me, when I was in my 20s, I was classified as a different generation than I am now, right? So like those labels have shifted over time. So it is really hard to like box people into these things. But I think everybody kind of hit on like the main point is like we as humans, we as leaders have to remember to teach the valuable lessons down from generation to generation. And what I would say as a mid 30 now 40-year-old, when I got into politics, it is hard to find somebody in politics to mentor or teach you if you're outside of the sphere. Everybody is in it for their career or their profit or their power. And if you want to have a voice and you want to be involved, there's really nobody to help you. You're kind of on your own, and it can be very frustrating. I had lots of friends that I tried to bring into the arena with me to help, and they were just like, I have no interest being here. This is not the environment I want to be in. And I think that's the environment that's been cultivated over the last, few decades, and it doesn't have to be that way. I think it can be different. We just have to enter that arena, learn, and then teach, and try not to, make the same mistakes as our the leaders in front of us. Um, but I want to get us out of here on kind of a fun question. I'm from Virginia. Brad, you're from Ohio. You're in Ohio, right?
That's right. Yeah, I'm an Ohioan.
All right. So, which state has the better set of presidents, Virginia or Ohio?
Well, I don't think there's any way. There's no comparison. I mean, there's no way that Washington, Jefferson, and Madison can stand up to the likes of Hayes, Harrison, and Harding. I mean, clearly, Ohio's the answer. No, obviously Virginia would seem to be more distinguished. But I will say this as we leave: I think the presidency of U.S. Grant and surprisingly to many people, the presidency of Warren G. Harding are both underrated. I think they were both better presidents than they're given credit for. But
Mm.
yeah, no, I used to live in Virginia all the way. Those early founding presidents did a good job, despite the fact that they were white male slaveholders and everything, in terms of setting up a system of government that would endure and lead to a very free and prosperous country. They were the men.
Yeah, it's funny because when I traveled through Ohio this year, and we stopped at the Hayes, McKinley, and Harding presidential libraries on our way, and I picked up these things for my daughter, which is like just like it's a laminated sheet of all the presidents on one side and the vice presidents on the other side, and they're listed underneath which state they belong to, and I counted them up, and they had more presidents from Ohio, and I'm like, "This can't be right." And they skewed the way they represented where the presidents were from based on, like, where they were living at the time they were elected versus where they were born, and I was like, so Ohio actually had more presidents on that sheet, but if you drive outside of Ohio, the sheet is different. So I thought, like, obviously Ohio has an axe to grind against Virginia somehow.
Jeff, you've missed your calling, babe. You should be an accountant. You should definitely be an accountant, studying that kind of detail on the placemat.
Well, I am not I'm not typically that detailed on something. I was just trying to teach my daughters, and I'm like, yeah, Virginia's got, like, they're the state because we're from Virginia, and they're counting them up, and they're like, Dad, no, there's more from Ohio here. And I didn't believe them, so, like, I had to go back. We were actually at the first lady's house, Ida McKinley, which if you've ever been to, it's Canton, it's in Canton, Ohio. It's a great place to visit. The Ida McKinley house, it's where William McKinley was living, I think when he was campaigning and when he was a congressman there. And the park rangers were really helpful. They didn't know the answer right at first, but they went and they figured it out for me, and I was like, oh, that makes sense now. Walter, what do you think, Virginia or Ohio?
Well, I think George Washington was technically from the United Kingdom, so I'm going to pick the United Kingdom as the best place that a president has been from.
No, you're supposed to pick if the set of presidents, Virginia or Ohio. You have to pick
Oh
one.
yeah, well, see, I don't do very well with boxes, and so if you force me to pick something, I refuse to answer your question. Although it's lovely, and I I accept that Virginia has more, and it includes George Washington. If you draw the line, just so.
Roger.
Yeah, and I'm offended that you malign President Polk from North Carolina. I don't understand what that's about. He's our only shot, man, and you're just like trashing him, dismissing him right off the top.
Hey, I'll tell you, Polk was one of the most efficient presidents we've ever had in American history. Now, that's the nicest thing I can say about Polk. And
Yes.
he was, dude. That dude was a workaholic. He said what he was going to do, and he did what he said. And there is something admirable to that. Now, you could argue that the way he did it and what he did should have been done differently, but that is a topic for another day.
Yeah. Still won't overtake Virginia, though. I vote Virginia.
All right. That was an easy one. It's always Virginia, because, Virginia's awesome, and I love this state. All right. So thank you, guys. Let's go around the horn. Last words. Brad, I'll let you go first.
I don't really know what to say other than, Citizens United has been our main topic of conversation, and I would urge people who are critical of Citizens United to think hard about it. Not because it necessarily will change their mind, but I think it will change at least the kind of solutions that they propose. While I probably am still not going to be convinced that those are good solutions, I think they're more likely to be on target than ranting about corporations aren't people or something like that, and doing sort of ill-considered legislation based on faulty premises like that.
Roger?
Well, I'll stick with my pattern. The last time the U.S. House of Representatives was expanded, the high school graduation rate was about 18% in this country. That is 18%. Our world has changed a lot in the past century, but we're still stuck with the same old house. I say it's time to change.
Walter?
The First Amendment was meant to be second. Your right to representation was meant to be first. It doesn't exist. It's not really about you versus the corporations. It's about you and the House of Representatives. If you get that clear, that is the first point which you must attack when you're sitting around at Thanksgiving or Christmas or Hanukkah and your family member is moaning about Trump or AOC or whomever it is. The answer is to point back to the solutions. And the first solution, the first step is clear: repeal and replace the 1929 Permanent Apportionment Act.
Yeah, so I just want to clarify. George Washington was born in Virginia. Like you said that, and I was just like, is that
Well, he
true?
was born in Virginia when it was a colony of the United Kingdom.
Okay, all right. I understand what you're saying now. All right, I gotcha.
Okay.
I was confused for a second. I was like, what? All right.
He's a lawyer, man. He's a lawyer.
Yeah, I forgot. He's a lawyer. Okay. So my last words is, number one, I don't know if anybody noticed, but I changed my sticker right here. This is a sticker from a local pizza place that I've been going to for my entire life. It's right down the street from me. It's called Spatoni's. It's absolutely delicious. It's in New Baltimore. And these are the things that really make America great, right? Like, what is great is the businesses, the entrepreneurs that can build businesses that can become part of your town, that you can go to as a kid with your parents and your grandparents. And now I'm going with my parents, who are now my kids' grandparents, with my kids, and we're telling stories. Like, there used to be a video game over there called Cruisin' USA. That's where I first learned to play, and I just think they're really great. So I just wanted to point that out to everybody. And then obviously, thank you for tuning in.
Sponsoring?
They are not sponsoring. I just really love their pizza.
Oh, you got to work on that. Okay. All right, keep going.
I just really love their pizza. So thank you all for joining us once again tonight. If you're interested about representation, if you want to learn more, you want to help out the No Cap Fund, you can go to our website, www.y435.org. You can learn about representation. You can find our reading list. You can find our representation station. You can sign up to be a volunteer. You can sign our declaration, and you can even make a donation because, as we talked about tonight, money is essential in politics, whether you like it or not. And so, I just want to say thank Brad for coming on the show. I think your insight is just fantastic. I really appreciated it, all you had to say. And so thank you to our audience. And as always, peace, love, and representation. Thank you for tuning in to the Representation Station. Don't forget to visit our website at www.y435.org and sign the Declaration for Representation. And don't forget to follow us on social media. You can find us on X at No Cap Fund, on Facebook, No Cap Fund, on YouTube at Uncap the House, and on Instagram at No Cap Fund. Thank you, and don't forget, peace, love, and representation.